The water washed in as far up as the intersection by McDonald's and up between McDonald's and the village market and the police station, that area. It was about as high as the water got there. And some of the biggest, heaviest boats, fishing boats and big old scows and things that got pushed into town, they got left there when the water receded because they didn't move as fast.
Oh, okay.
Even though the water washed out fairly fast and took a lot of boats and buildings with it, some of the biggest ones were left in town. And one of them, biggest one of all in those days here was a big old boat called the Salif. And it had got washed up to, I think it's Peking Restaurant, up where Dr. Guy's office is, about where his building is. And the thing stayed there on the side of the hill. There was the old Salif sitting up there.
Oh, gosh.
And it was loaded with crab. They hadn't got it unloaded.
Great stuff. Oh, loaded with crab. So what happened with the crab?
They rotted. And that was one of the urgent things to be done when they got bulldozers in, is to clear some sort of a pathway down the street, and so they could push some of these old boats back into the water. And they had to get rid of that crab because it was when it warmed up. And I think it was 4,000 king crabs. Quite a few. I think the downtown district was where the downtown district is now, the main mall in that area. It was about 1967, summer of '67, before the new permanent buildings were put up down around the mall area. And in the meantime, this part of the island had sunk. It dropped to about 8 feet or 8.5 feet below what it had been before. So then that meant that every high tide we had, at least the higher high tides, would come right up into the town, and they came right across the main road. So you couldn't, if you were on the other side of about where Kraft's store parking lot entrance is on Rosanna, about that point on out, you couldn't come to this part of town.
Oh, okay.
And vice versa, of course. One during high tide. And that continued for quite a while until they were able to haul enough fill in to build it up in that low area where the water came in so far. But there were many times when I'd come off the mountain from work and come down the backside of the mountain, park our big trucks over there in Aleutian Homes, and then I'd get in my car to come home. But if it happened to be a real high tide, I couldn't go home. There's another area that where some lives were lost in the first tsunami. When the earthquake hit, probably because this part of the island sank 8 feet or so, the water level rose very fast. Not violent, not like the tsunami later, but it rose very fast, and it came up high enough that in low-lying areas it dumped trash all over. And out at Kelson Bay, the road used to run from the bottom of that big hill, just this side of Kelson Inn. It turned back on itself and down to the beach, and followed the beach along. Very low-lying there. And then when this water rose, it put a whole bunch of driftwood on the road, so you couldn't drive across it.
Kind of barricaded the road there.
Yeah, and there's pieces of logs and things laying all over the stretch of road for about a medium mile or a little more, where it was right along the beach. Then there were some people that were out beyond that on the road system, including two good friends of ours and close neighbors who were drowned there. They had been out at the Sag Shack area. Mm-hmm. They both had the day off because of Good Friday. He was a music teacher at the school and band instructor and so forth, and she worked for the city as a clerk. And they both had the day off, and they loved to go outdoors and hike and beachcomb and this and that. So they went out in the morning, and they invited my wife to go with them. And she would have gone too, but she couldn't find a babysitter to come in the morning and stay all day. Mm-hmm. And so she didn't go, and was at work. And then, as it happened, they were still out at Sag Shack when the earthquake hit. And when that happened, they jumped in their Jeep and headed back to town. And they got as far back as the far side of Calson Bay, and there were some cars stopped there on a little high area on the east side of the bay. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't go across in that low-lying area. So then the men in the group decided that they would take a couple of vehicles, and they would go along and get out and move these things by hand, these logs and things, and open up a route so that they could get the cars through. And so they started doing that, and our friends Gene and Rose Schultz, Gene was going to go with the men too, and then Rose thought they didn't have any children or anything, and she could drive the Jeep. She thought she could help by driving one of the vehicles, so she did. But the other women and some children stayed with their cars there to wait for the road to be opened. Then the men got down about halfway along, and there were 6 men altogether and Rose. And then that happened. It was just 33 minutes after the first earthquake, the big one, when the first tsunami hit. And in Calson Bay, because of the kind of a funnel shape of the bay, it built up and was very high and violent in there, and it caught them about halfway along, and they couldn't escape it. And so those 7 people were killed there. My immediate family, this is 2 brothers and their families, and at that time, one of them lived in Anchorage, and the other lived stateside in Seattle, or Redmond, at that time. And then, of course, I have aunts and uncles and cousins back in the Midwest. But the communications were out, and so they were quite concerned when they heard that. I heard about the Alaska earthquake, and especially when some of the news reports, some of the first ones, indicated that the island of Kodiak sank.
Oh my gosh.
Some of Gretchen's relatives in Europe and some other friends of ours in Norway heard it on European broadcasts that Kodiak Island had sunk. But they didn't know what that meant, I guess they imagined that the whole damn island just went under the water. Some people were very concerned. And then, like I say, we couldn't communicate with them for some time.